It is quite a pleasure to be back up here again. It's my annual July. I get to preach to you. And I kind of overdid it today. I'm going a little long, so I decided to skip the responsive reading, if that's okay with you, and I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to introduce it with an article that's actually 10 years old now, and maybe some of you have heard it before. It was in the New York Times by Mark Oppenheimer, and it came out August 17th, 2012, and it's titled, "Unitarians Break with Tradition of Extended Time Off in Summer." I'm not going to leave this part out because it kind of ties to the Wonderbox story that Christina said. Here's what it says. If you phone a Unitarian church between the middle of June and Labor Day in September, the most you are apt to get is a recorded message, Charles S. Slapp said in his sermon at the First Unitarian Society of Schenectady, New York on September 8, 1985. Our more orthodox friends never cease to be astounded by the contents of the message. This church is closed for the summer. If you are one of those people who actually need a church during the summer, try the Presbyterians. Was he joking? Well, in part. Mr. Slapp surely did not wish Presbyterianism on potential followers. But in the matter of his own church being closed for the summer, he was serious. Indeed, he added, 85% of Unitarian societies go into their strange ecclesiastical hibernation in the summer months. Although Mr. Slapp did not give a source for his figure, the sermon text can be found in his book, Two Black Cats, published in 1993, a year after his death. Unitarians of a certain age will acknowledge the truth in what he said. After the school year ended, God took a break, and Unitarians took to Cape Cod in Massachusetts. So clearly times have changed because you're all here. We're all here. And although summers are rather short here, just like they are in Massachusetts, as Reverend Christina said, most of us do not have lives that allow us to take the summer off. Although many of you are retired, and I've heard that that includes summers off. So here we are talking today about spiritual delights centered in love. This idea for this sermon came to me. I know you use Soul Matters packets here, but I don't think you use Soul Matters programming in the summer and June, and my congregations do. And so the theme for the month of June was delight. And the Reverend Scott Taylor, who's the founder of the Soul Matters program and still leads it, created this poetic list of delights which help his spirit soar. And I've edited it to kind of most of the summertime ones that he included. So Taylor says, because the road turns long and lonely sometimes, I build this box of delight to open and reach into when I need to. And here's what's in it. My children laughing together. The look of giddy disbelief on my mother's face when that black-capped chickadee swooped in and landed next to her knee, waking her from her Alzheimer's days. The bitter bite of rhubarb pie smothered by a spoonful of half-melted vanilla ice cream. That field of fireflies. Kickball. Deep dish pizza. The smell of a tangerine. French press coffee. The first bite of a perfectly made croissant, proving that decadence sometimes purifies the soul. An artichoke with no limits on butter. Mixtapes made with tunes from the 80s. Sweatshirts worn faithfully for 20 years, their holes a reminder that to be used up is a gift. Stumbling on black raspberries while walking in the woods. No, strike that. Instead, let's put in having a loved one save you some black raspberries they found in the woods. That sweet night owl quiet when worries don't seem so big or so scary. I love this one. My 6-year-old daughter writing, "I love you, Mom and Dad," on the car seat in permanent marker. The way subway street musicians suddenly turn strangers into humans. And the feeling of getting warm after being cold. I think I could tell from the laughter and the nods that you can easily imagine what's being described. Just hearing some of these descriptions stirred memories and feelings in me and a sense of delight that takes me out of myself and transcends space and time, which is my definition of spiritual delight. So for my, we call them chalice circles in my congregations, for my chalice circle, I did this spiritual exercise and came up with a list, and I'm going to share just a few of them. Sitting in my lawn chair in the backyard at sunrise with my coffee, waiting for the sun to clear the neighbor's tree and shine on my face, which takes till after 7 o'clock, so I'm out there for a while. Listening to a recording of my choir performing a particularly favorite piece of choral music. When a close friend and I really connect in a conversation and the whole world around us just stands still. And lastly, planting peonies with my Aunt Evie, which I will come back to that one. So all of these lists, and I'm sure you've conjured up your own list of delights while I was talking, what do they have in common? A few things come to mind. There's a connection, obviously, this very visceral connection, almost sensual in some cases. And then one layer level in my mind is this sense of belonging. You're belonging with others, but you're not just connected to it as if it's something out here, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that. In my case, I feel like I'm transported to that place and time with those people, like that is where I belong at that moment. And every single one of them was pure, simple joy. But all of them, love, all of these, I think, are centered in some form of love. Either a love of the thing, or a love of the experience being described, or simply the loved ones that are included in the description. These are all very similar also in that they're very intimate, very personal experiences. Or said another way, they occur at this very micro level. It's not some grandiose, sweeping macro level like going to a Green Day concert where everybody's in love with what's going on, right? This is very intimate. And I think they delight our spirits because they are so familiar. Now, these concepts are exactly what Dr. Brené Brown is referring to in her blog, Doubling Down on Love, that she published October 9th, 2019, which that date is kind of important because it was right before the election and then ultimately right before the pandemic started, but we didn't know that at the time. So if you're not familiar with Dr. Brown, through her extensive research as a sociologist, Brown claims that belonging, connection, joy, and love are essential for healthy human development. In fact, she says our brains are basically hardwired for it. We seek it out. So all of these examples naturally trigger positive and even spiritual emotions. But her blog is titled Double Down on Love because it's a call to action and a call that I think Unitarian Universalism also wants us to answer. Brown writes about micro and macro expressions of love and believes we live in a time when we must have both. She cites the writings of the social critic Bell Hooks, particularly Hooks' book, All About Love, and the concept of a love ethic, or said another way, centering ourselves and our values on love as the focal point of our lives. In my case, I always think of it this way, always asking the question, what is the most loving thing to do in this circumstance? This love ethic encourages us to leverage love we gain from spiritual delight, this intimate, personal spiritual delight, and then leverage it for good in the world. Brené Brown interprets Hooks' message this way. quote, "Doubling down on love demands that we be brave enough to straddle the tension of staying awake to the struggle in the world and fighting for justice and peace, while also cultivating a love ethic in our own lives. We can't sacrifice the micro for the macro or the macro for the micro. Love, belonging, connection, and joy are irreducible needs for all of us. We can't give people what we don't have, and we have to live love to give love." In other words, my interpretation would be we need to spend our summer seeking the spiritual delights that nurture our love. But if we really are truly going to live a love ethic, we need to leverage our personal love to help heal our world. So that's really the theological point I want to make today, that I want you to take away, but I want to unpack it a little bit with a couple of stories and describe this unexpected spiritual journey I've been on this summer. Or I could have retitled this sermon, "What My Yard Taught Me This Summer." Remember I said I was going to come back to planting peonies with my Aunt Evie? I need to explain a little bit about that. My Aunt Evie was my mom's older sister who never married, lived alone, was an 8th grade history teacher, actually went to college at the age of 35 to get her degree and come back to this little tiny town in northern Illinois to teach 8th grade history, and everybody says she was fantastic at it. She had this tiny little house in this tiny little yard, and she loved to be out there gardening, and she gardened with a knife. She would break up the soil with like a butcher knife. It was the newspaper actually did an article on her one time. But in the back of her little yard, she lined the entire perimeter with peony bushes. Peony bushes, that's kind of odd, don't you think? Well, in her case, it tied her to her ancestors, because peonies in northern Illinois bloom the week before Memorial Weekend. And so she would have probably 1,000 blossoms of peonies in her backyard, and she would save coffee cans, and she would wrap them in foil, and then she would pick buckets full of these peonies, put them in water, and then on Memorial Weekend, every coffee can, there must have been 20, 25 of them, would have this bouquet, and we'd drive around this town in the countryside and place that on every gravesite. Now, my ancestors came to this country in the mid-1800s, and so some of these were just no more than 20 decaying headstones written in German at some crossroads where paths happened to cross at the time. But it was very, very important to her to remember the ancestors. I think that's why she was a history teacher, and she had this extraordinary way of doing it. So when I remember planting peonies with Aunt Evie, it was when my parents had bought their first home, and we were out in the country, and she took peony bushes from her yard, and I was helping her transplant them along the lot line in our first yard. It's one of my very first memories. And from that, I learned all about dirt, how important dirt was, and what's the difference between clay and dirt. And earthworms, I remember just holding them, and she talked about how earthworms were so important to create the dirt, how to care for transplants, how to care for the earth. This was my very first encounter with the interdependent web of all existence. It's actually my very first memory, and I was 3 years old. Well, now, 60 years later, I've had this weird spiritual experience that ties back to that one. I now live in a home that I bought 2 years ago that's also very small, with a very small yard, and the yard's been kind of neglected for decades. And so we tried to hire someone to help us out with this, and they removed all the sod, but it was a disaster. And so now I have this yard full of weeds that are just growing haphazardly. There wasn't much more grass in the first place. But what we've decided to do to help the environment is we're going to plant a clover lawn. And so that takes a lot of extra work to get it prepared and all this kind of stuff. And it's a mess. And so right now it's about 40% clover, and the rest is just crazy looking. So I have decided to hand weed this front yard. So I'm sitting there and I'm digging up spots of it, and I'm looking at the earthworms, and I'm actually talking to the earthworms sometimes. And I happen to live in a place where we are right on the walking path for everybody in the neighborhood with their dogs. So they come by all the time. So they either think I'm quaint or a kook, and I'm not sure which yet. In fact, one day a woman walked by while I was out there in the middle of all this, and she sarcastically said, "Looks like fun." And without even thinking, I said, "Actually it is. I feel like I'm in a sandbox." But it's just become a spiritual practice to work on this. I can't do more than an hour or an hour and a half at a time, but to really connect with the dirt, get my hands dirty. And it's led me to a lot of memories and a lot of deep thinking. So it's sort of this spiritual delight that went deeper. And it's really helped me recontemplate or reconnect with what it means to be interdependent, or what our seventh principle, interdependence, is about. So where does this all lead me? What is my inner spirit calling me? How is it calling me? And what is the macro story here? Well, eventually, I started thinking of the history of the area. My neighborhood, until they replaced the storm sewers, which maybe was a decade ago, the storm sewers had a direct connection into the Fox River. And the children at the environmental school, charter school nearby, every summer, every spring would come by and spray paint a sign on the storm sewer reminding us that it led directly into the Fox River, to be careful of what we put down those. And then downtown, for years, there's always been people fishing, usually people of color, who don't look particularly well off. And I'm assuming that whatever they catch out of the river is probably supplementing their food sources. And so I wanted to make extreme efforts all those years to avoid putting any chemical on my lawn, or any fertilizer that would run off, or, God forbid, motor oil or something like that. Because I love those people who I don't even know. And I love that they should have the right to thrive in my world. So then I went to a more distant path, which is probably 50 years ago. I'm reminded of all the paper companies who seriously polluted the river and the feeder lakes for decades with cancer-causing chemicals. Now, I know at the time it was legal. I know at the time they didn't know they caused cancer. But these are smart people, and for some reason you'd kind of wonder, if you're dumping stuff into this nice clean lake that kind of is toxic, that it might have an impact. You just kind of wonder. And I worked for one of the largest paper companies for 25 years, which to my knowledge never contributed to the pollution in that serious way, but the industry generally seemed to have this total disregard for the environment and the humans dependent on food sources from it. I can't even fathom how many people suffered illnesses and death for decades because of sort of this hidden little secret. And if you've ever been close to someone suffering from cancer, you understand the slogan, "Cancer sucks." Only the cruel-hearted could turn away from such suffering. And my love in my heart goes out to them, all of those who died, and those who maybe still are alive and hoping to recover. And then I was playing in the dirt and the worms. My mind went even further back. You see, I live on the backside of Pierce Park, if you know Appleton very well. I'm on that bluff that overlooks the Fox River. Lutz Park is down below me. The house is across the street. I don't quite live in that fancy a house. But it's a very beautiful place. It's surrounded by parks, and it's probably been that way forever. And probably the people that lived here before white people came also enjoyed that spot. So I decided to do some research and understand where this property came from. And I learned that in 1836, the largest American Indian population in Wisconsin, the Menominee, were pressured to sell away 11,600 square miles of land along the lower Fox River. That's where I live. So essentially, my wealth-generating home, I'm hoping that it covers my medical bills when I'm in a nursing home, and the soil I'm cultivating as a spiritual practice was stolen 187 years ago. How can I not love those people who also love this land? We have this connection across hundreds of years. But it also makes me question, is this spirituality kind of blemished? Even though the government spent millions cleaning up the carcinogenic waste and made the river safe again, what about the generational harm caused to the unknown and marginalized? I can't help but understand that I've benefited directly from a white supremacy culture that was rigidly in place at the time and all the racist practices that they undertook. Interdependence is one of our key values lifted up by our seventh principle. So my spiritual journey has given me new insight. It's not just about the interdependent of beings next door, I don't want to poison their dog, or downstream or downwind. It's also interdependence through time, generations into the future, and what do I owe generations in the past? The ancestors. What is it calling me to do as a Unitarian Universalist? What is my love ethic calling me to do? So I decided I'm borrowing the language contained in the proposed new version of the seventh principle because, frankly, I like it more. So if you're not familiar with it, it starts out with roughly the same definition we currently have, and then it adds two parts. So part one that's added basically is about do no harm in the future. And I've rewritten it as a minister of a congregation, and it would say, I, in partnership with my beloved congregants, covenant to cherish earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. So that's cool. And I can pretty much guess most of the people in this room do many, or at least one of these things I'm about to list. Purchase food raised without chemicals. If you can't afford organic, at least you try to go natural or grow it yourself. We seem to be militant about recycling. Many of us compost, if you've got a backyard that can fit that in. Have you ever looked at our parking lot with the fuel-efficient cars out there, now electric cars? And I have two congregations who have actually invested in solar panels on the roof of their churches, of their fellowships. So I think we do a pretty good job of thinking about trying to avoid making things worse. But then there's the new part two, which basically says we need to acknowledge and heal the past. So again, my editorializing of it, with humility and reverence, my congregants and I acknowledge our place in the great web of life and try to repair harm and damaged relationships. Okay, that's the tougher one, because what's done is done. How do I think about that? What do I do with that? Well, to me, the first and most important thing is to tell the untold stories. We can't go into the future assuming that when white folks arrived here, that was when magically it just all started. There were people before, there were stories that haven't been told, and we should at least know those stories. Perhaps we could go in and invite those who have been wronged back into our world. I know a lot of states and churches are considering reparations. It's complicated, but it's something we should at least consider. So let me go back to Brene Brown. To me, this is what Brown refers to as leveraging my love into actionable love in the world. My spiritual journey has led me to engage deeply with the earth in my own really unique way, and then consider how my love ethic extends beyond myself to others. As a Unitarian Universalist, my spiritual delight must be centered in love. First, love of myself and taking care of me. Love of the earth, the soil, the river, the land. Love of the interdependent web of all existence. And then love of all those who have been marginalized and hurt by my ancestors. Love of the richness of human diversity. Love of justice. Frankly, love of hope to live in a world where all have the opportunity to thrive. All of these are interconnected and interdependent. All must be centered in love. I don't get to pick and choose the ones that are convenient. then I'm truly living into my faith grounded in a theology of love in the center. I don't have all the answers. That's why it's called a spiritual journey. Where will it lead me? I don't know. What will I learn, experience, and love? So as you engage in your spiritual delights this summer, I invite you to ponder them a bit longer, a bit more deeply, and through a lens of love. See where your musings take you, and then ask yourself, where is love here? What would be the most loving thing to do? Or how is Unitarian Universalism calling us to be centered in love? And I wish us all fruitful spiritual journeys all summer long. Amen.